So thanks everybody. There we go. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry I can't see you really or hear you, but I'm very happy to take questions at the end. It might be an idea if you think of anything during the talk, just to write it in the chat, and then maybe Matt will be able to read them out at the end, and we can have a bit more of an informal chat at the end as well. But otherwise, I'll go through this presentation. As Matt just said, I'm a historical costumier working in Nottingham in England. I mainly make museum quality reconstructions for museums and heritage sites, and increasingly for private individuals, basically ever since I was published as part of the Tudor Tailor with my co-author Jane Malcolm Davis. I have more and more inquiries for private commissions, which I do take on as well. And every now and again, I get asked to take part in some filming or TV work, which is what I'm going to talk about today a little bit more. So yes, this talk, as you can see, is entitled Stitches in Time, Reconstructing the Jupon of the Black Prince. The TV series, it was made for the BBC back in 2017. And it was a 6-part series, so some of you may have caught an episode or maybe all 6 episodes. But the premise of the programme was that we would take an item of clothing, in this case an extant or existing item of clothing, or working from a portrait or sculpture, we would reconstruct that item of clothing using the only available methods that we used at the time, so entirely by hand and using the technology that was available at the time that the garment was actually made. And this particular episode was a reconstruction of the jupon worn by the Black Prince. At the beginning of each episode, the presenter, Amber Butchart, would come here to the studio, show me what the garment was that we were going to make, and we would discuss how we were going to do it, what the challenges were. And so in the case of the Black Prince, the first image that I was shown was, oops. There we go. Was this one, which is of course the effigy of the Black Prince, which is on top of his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. In this effigy, he's depicted wearing a fitted sleeveless garment over the top of his full harness of plate armour. And the purpose of this garment, as I'm sure many of you will know, is heraldic display. And it's embellished with the quartered arms of France, the fleur-de-lis, and England, the 3 lions. This isn't actually the garment we were going to attempt to make. The garment that we were going to make hangs above the tomb, or did for hundreds of years, above the tomb in Canterbury. And you can see at a glance that it's quite different in nature. It's still quartered with the arms of France and England, but it's not the slim, the thin, fitted garment that we can see on the effigy that's worn over the top of the armour. It's a much more, as well as being the display of the heraldic devices, it is actually a defensive garment. It's padded with cotton fibre, which is sandwiched between layers of velvet and linen canvas. And that's quite hard to imagine on this, what remains of the original garment, because of course all the colour has all but completely disappeared from the garment. The pile of the velvet is completely gone. So what we can see is just areas of the ground of the velvet and not the pile. And it would have been embroidered with silver and gold, and all of that metal has, well, nearly all of it, unless you look very closely, has gone. So it looks a kind of sad shadow of its once glorious self. And the idea of the programme really was to properly envisage, to actually see how magnificent this garment would have looked when it was new. So textile armour such as this was designed to be worn both with armor or some types of textile armor without the metal armor, and the textile armor was the only protection for the wearer. In this case, it was worn over the top of the metal armor to further protect the body from direct blows. Now, often when I give this talk, it's to people like the Embroiderers Guild, who are particularly interested in the textiles and the embroidery. For this audience, talking to you today, I probably don't need to tell you the bit that I'm about to say, which is garments like this in the 14th century were variously described by lots of different names. So we've got jupons, gambesons, coat armors, pourpoints, and acatons. And it's very hard to know what the Black Prince would have called this garment, to be definitive about what he would have called it. To quote Jerry Embleton from his book, Medieval Military Costume, which was published in 2000, he says, these 14th century terms for defensive fabric garments worn with some types of armor cannot be clearly defined. Medieval man's free and apparently interchangeable and contradictory use of such words defeats our modern passion for assigning everything to exact categories. And this is something I come up against time and time again when I'm researching clothing from a long time ago. And usually the further back in time you go, the harder it is. And I don't think it's a problem that's unique to the early modern or medieval period. I often do think that dress historians in hundreds of years' time who are trying to establish what people wore in the early 21st century will come across the same issues, because we do have lots of different names for the same garment, which taken out of context can be very difficult to understand. So, you know, the garment I'm wearing, I would call a cardigan, but you might also have a sweater or a pullover or a jumper. And it's quite hard with the distance of time to actually work out what people meant by these different words. In the case of this garment, it's clear from the rich embroidery that's worked all over the surface that it's intended to be worn over the top of the armor, as in the effigy, as an impressive display of rank and status. The fact is also borne out by the unusual proportions of the garment. The waist is very narrow, measuring 32 inches, and that's over the top of the armor, while the chest is broad, measuring 46 inches. So this very kind of hourglass figure was likely only achieved by it being worn over the top of the armor, which is of course in a very globular style. The breastplate is a very globular style worn during this period. And the other thing I should point out about this image, which is the most commonly seen version of the original garment, is that it's actually seen from the back. So what we're looking at now is the back of the garment. Now in the programme, ordinarily when I'm commissioned to make something for a museum or a heritage site, if it's based on a garment which actually exists, it will be arranged that I can go and study that garment, look at the construction techniques, take measurements, draft a pattern, write down some kind of idea of the order of the processes that were used to make the garment. This being TV, those rules didn't apply. And actually, it was deemed that the most important person to go and look at the original garment was the television presenter. So Amber Butchart went to see the garment and be filmed looking at the garment, but I didn't actually get to go and see the original. I had seen it in the Victoria and Albert Museum had displayed it as part of their exhibition called Opus Anglicanum on English embroidery, but I hadn't been able to study it up close. And in fact, when it came down from that exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, it was decided that it was in such desperate state of conservation, in need of conservation, that they would not hang it again up over the effigy until all of that work had been done. So it's not currently on display at Canterbury Cathedral, and they're very much limiting the number of people who can go and study it because it's so incredibly fragile. So fortunately for me, the there's an amazing dress historian called Janet Arnold, who some of you may have heard of before. She had studied the garment back in 1989, and she'd taken a pattern and written these very extensive notes and annotations on that pattern. And that was published in the Journal of the Church Monument Society, which is quite an obscure little journal. I think it's still possible to get hold of some copies. And she wrote a whole article about the jupon. She, in fact, the title of the paper is The Jupon or Coat Armour of the Black Prince. So she was kind of hedging her bets about what the garment was actually called. But during the course of this programme, I had quite a lot of discussion with Toby Capwell, who I think is going to be speaking to you tomorrow, from the Wallace collection, and he took part in the programme as well. And in his opinion, he felt that the term coat armour is more usually used to refer to the unpadded kind of heraldic garment, such as the one that's worn on the effigy, rather than the heavily quilted piece that we're looking at. So Janet Arnold's work here was just really invaluable, because she's taken, I've used lots of her patterns in the past, and she takes very scrupulous, detailed notes, very exacting measurements, and it really is the next best thing to actually being able to go and see the thing in person. So, working from this pattern and Janet Arnold's notes, the first thing we decided to do was actually make up a mock-up or a toile. So what you're looking at here is me trying on a mock-up made in calico and cotton wadding to the exact measurements of the original. And I'm wearing what probably most of you will know is actually a 15th century style breastplate. That's because my husband, Michael, who you can see in the left-hand image, happened to have one in his in his room next door. And we thought that it would be a good exercise to see if, you know, a smallish woman, me, I'm approximately a similar size to Amber. If I was to wear the jupon made to the same size as the original over the top of armor, would it look completely ridiculous? Because with all of the other episodes, what we did was actually make the garments to fit Amber's measurements. But that's because we weren't working from surviving extant examples. And it just seemed that this was an opportunity too good to miss, to make a replica that really was exactly the same dimensions as the original, because really then you would get a sense of the man himself. You know, it was made for and belonged to and was worn by a real human being who existed. So that's what we wanted to do, but we were aware that he was an extremely tall person, a very different shape to a young woman. So the other person you can see in the photograph is Hannah Marples. She was doing an internship or work placement as a costume student with me at the time, and she worked on all 6 episodes of A Stitch in Time. And you'll see later that she was had a very integral part to play with this reconstruction. So we decided, having made this toile, that it didn't look, I mean, it looked quite silly, but it didn't look so silly that it was a bad idea to reconstruct it to the size. So we proceeded on that basis. So the premise of the programme, as I said earlier, was that all of the reconstructions should be made entirely by hand, using only known period methods that we used at the time. But as is usual with television programmes, there is neither time nor budget to do things often in exactly the way that we would want. So we didn't have the time or the budget to do the embroidery ourselves. Also, we're not professional embroiderers. And it wasn't possible to give this work to embroiderers here in the UK. The team of makers for the programme was very small. It was myself and Hannah, and then another costumier, Harriet Waterhouse, who I had not worked with before, but she's done some amazing work that I knew of, including all of the hand-sewn garments for the productions at the Globe Theatre. So she was a great person to have on board. So for the embroidery, I decided to contact a team of embroiderers in India that I had used several times before. They're called Aresh Designs, and they're based in Mumbai. And I knew that they produced work of a very high quality and could turn things around amazingly quickly. They have a team of embroiderers who are all men, which is as it would have been in the 14th century for the Black Prince's embroidered garments. They had all been done in a professional workshop of male embroiderers. So fortunately, the way that this embroidery is carried out on the original Jupon is that the embroidered motifs are actually worked on a ground of linen, and then that is cut out and sewn to the garment, which was ideal for us because it meant that we could have the embroidery going on while we made the garment, and then we could unite the two together rather than having to embroider directly on the velvet fabric. So what you're looking at here is a very close-up picture of one of the fleur-de-lis in the embroidery. And for these close-up pictures that I'm going to be using in this PowerPoint, I'm very grateful to Lisa Monas, who is a textile and embroidery historian. And she was one of the few people who was permitted access to the garment, and she was studying it primarily for the embroidery. But she was very generous with sharing both her knowledge and her insights and her photographs, which would have been very difficult to have made the reconstruction without having these photographs. So this is one of the fleur-de-lis, and it's underneath a mesh, which is a conservation mesh, so it's not part of the original garment. What remains of the embroidery is extremely degraded. So the gleaming gold has long gone, and what you're seeing is the thread was silver gilt. So it's a core of textile, of silk, wrapped in silver, and then the silver is gilded. So all the gold gilt has come off. You're left with bits of silver and bits of silk, and the silver that's there has tarnished to an almost black colour. The fleur-de-lis weren't actually too difficult to figure out in terms of the design because, of course, it's a recognisable standard shape and it's not especially detailed. They're relatively simple shapes that are filled with couched gold threads. The lions, on the other hand, were much more challenging. They're much more detailed, and where the detail is missing, it's harder to guess what's going on. And again, as some of you probably know, in heraldic terms, actually, if a lion is in heraldic terms, if a lion is passant, standing on all fours and looking out at you, it's actually known as a leopard. So I will try and refer to them as leopards rather than lions from now on. But again, you can see this very tarnished silver that was underneath the gold. This would have been a bright sparkling gold before. And the outlines of the much thicker threads were used, couched on and used to really bring out those outline details of the face and the mane. So going back to the representation of the coat armor of the Black Prince on his, the effigy on his tomb, that's helpful because you can see the proportions of those leopards, how they're, they're very stylized for the heraldic device, stretched out, long, thin, winding tails. You can see the position of all of the limbs and the fact that the face is looking out. But of course, what you can't see, because it's a metal piece, is what types of stitches were used and how the embroidery was actually carried out. So for that, we had to do a bit of detective work, which is always the case when doing reconstructions of garments from the past. You can never get all of the answers from one source. You have to piece it together by looking at lots of different bits of evidence. So this amazing textile here is a fragment of a horse trapper in France, and it was made in England in about 1330 to 40. And the textile has survived in remarkable condition, and you can see the gold is still there and the silver is still there. And it really gives an insight into how the embroidery on the jupon would have looked or may have looked when it was new. And if we look at a close up here, you can see one of the mouths of the leopard, and the expression in these beasts is extraordinary. And we just love the way that they've done this, the curling fur of the mane and the tongue sticking out, and the teeth are embroidered in silver with the blue silk thread in between. So, but as I say, this textile is actually a horse trapper. So you can imagine the scale, because it was along the side of the horse, is much larger than the jupon for a person. So the scale of the leopards is much larger than the leopards on the jupon. And we didn't know whether we could get anything like the same degree of detail on our embroidery. But Hannah took on the task of doing the designs to send to India. And we tried to capture as much of this lively expression as we could. So these are Hannah's designs for both the fleur-de-lis and for the leopards. And as I say, she did lots of detail in the mane and the fur on the legs and the back. And we hoped that it would carry through, not just that whether it would be possible in the on the smaller scale of the leopards, but also in the time scale that the embroiderers had, which was very short. I should say that for the Stitch in Time series, we had these 6 different episodes, and the garments were entirely unrelated. We had this 14th century garment, we had a 15th century one, 18th century, and a 17th century. And we had to work on them all concurrently, because the way they filmed was that they would come here to the studio, and what they wanted to do was film the beginning and the middle and the end of all of the garments. So it was a very weird way to work, because you're getting a bit of an insight in this talk to the kind of level of research that you have to do for each garment. It's much better really to be able to focus only on one project at a time, but we were doing this same level of research for all 6 episodes, and it blew my mind a little bit. So we sent these designs off to the embroiderers, and the way we did that was, we could have just sent a digital file, but the embroiderers work in quite an old-fashioned way, as I say, very similar actually to the way it would have been done in the 14th century. And it's also much safer to send the designs in actual size drawn onto the pattern pieces in the exact position, so that we weren't relying on any kind of on the team over in India to do it themselves and risk miscommunication or things being printed out not quite the right size and all that sort of thing. So here's me and Hannah tracing through the designs that she printed out from her digital source onto the actual pattern pieces, which we then sent over to India, sorry. And what they did was the method of prick and pouncing. So they pricked holes in all of the lines that we had drawn of the designs and rubbed chalk through the holes onto the white linen that they were going to embroider. And as I say, this is a technique that would have been used at the time. So I think what I've got next to show you is rather excitingly, this is a video of the embroidery being carried out. So what we're looking at is the embroidery on the white linen stretched onto a very large frame, and the embroiderer here working on fleur-de-lis. And so the fleur-de-lis, what he's doing is couching threads, which means that he was laying the gold threads on top of the linen and then using stitches to hold them down in place. And it probably goes without saying that the gold thread they're using is not real gold. That was outside of the budget of the BBC, but it is metallic and it's cold to the touch and heavy. It has a nice convincing feel. Ooh. Let's play that. Okay. And you can see how quickly they work and how confidently. It's I haven't ever been over to see the workshop in person, but I would like to do that sometime. It's just amazing, and it's just so lovely that these skills still survive, at least somewhere. So here's one of the completed fleur-de-lis, which looks pretty stunning, lovely and shiny and gold. And so then I've got a second video here, which is the leopards being embroidered, and that's a bit different because what they're doing there is they're using a tool called a tambour hook. So it's like a tiny little metal hook, a bit like a crochet hook, and they use that to push the thread through the surface of the linen to actually hold the gold threads on the surface. Because when you're using gold threads or silver threads, you don't want any of those threads to be on the wrong side of the fabric, because it would be a complete waste. And it's also very difficult, it would be difficult to draw that thread through the fabric. So all of the gold or silver thread is laid on the top so that none of it is wasted by being unseen and underneath. So they're all using techniques that basically lay the gold on the surface. And tambour hooks weren't actually used in the 14th century. They came in the 18th century. But the chain stitch that they create is almost indiscernible or indistinguishable on the right side of the embroidery from if you did it with a needle and thread. So let's play that. And here's a close-up of one of the completed leopards. They sent us photographs as they went along to make sure that they were doing it the way that we wanted, and we were really delighted with how much detail they had actually managed to get into these little leopards. They've all got slightly different expressions, and I mean, Hannah had a bit of a love affair with these leopards, I have to say, because she conceived the design, and as we saw the embroidery coming through, she was naming them individually and becoming extremely attached. And actually, this photograph comes from, this was the first one they did, and we loved it. But actually, we then realised that in heraldry, the inside of the ears of the leopards were supposed to be blue in the same way that the tongues and the claws were, which I hadn't realised. I was corrected on. So the embroiderers had to go back over the ears and fill them in blue. So while the embroidery was going on, back in the studio, we were getting our heads around how we were actually going to make the garment itself. So this is another one of Lisa Monas's very helpful photographs. And although it doesn't look particularly impressive or attractive, it's really useful because it's one of the most degraded areas of the garment. So because so much of the top fabric has gone, we can see lots of the padding, the stuffing. So what we're looking at is basically the cotton fibre that was used to stuff the garment. And cotton fibre was used extensively in the 14th century for defensive garments and for other quilted items. And it's before it was actually used in England as a, it wasn't spun into thread that was used for either sewing or for weaving. And that was because we didn't have the technology to spin a thread that was strong enough for those purposes. So we were using raw cotton fibre for a long time before we worked out how to spin it for sewing and for weaving. Sometimes these garments might be stuffed with wool, but in this case, the fibre's been analysed and it is definitely cotton. So what we had to decide was how the stuffing was put inside the garment, what exactly was the method that was used. And as with so many of these reconstructions, the only way to do that was a bit of kind of experimental archaeology. So what we decided to do was to make different samples using different techniques. So we did several 10-inch squares. So this is just a piece of pieces of cotton velvet that were kind of scraps to do our mock-ups with. We did 2 that were not on a frame and 2 that were on the frame. So the advantage of the samples that were just worked in the hands was that actually Hannah worked on them while we were filming other bits of the episodes. So we could be getting underway with that. So sample A is one that was worked in the hands. And in this sample, the cotton wadding was placed between a layer of velvet and a layer of linen and kept in place with a border of basting or tacking around the outside edge. It was then quilted through with spaced running stitches. Sample B was also worked in the hands and not on a frame. And this time we joined our velvet and our linen backing together, and we stitched parallel lines into which we stuffed the wadding. And we used a wooden spoon to push the wadding inside the tubes, which is why you can see a wooden spoon on the frame there. And then we wondered, after we'd done those 2 samples, whether we should try working it on a frame in the same way that the embroidery was done. We know that frames were used by embroiderers in the 14th century. For example, there's accounts of Edward III's linen armourer, which call for thick linen threads to stretch the haunches, or the rump defence for a horse, upon frames. So perhaps the quilting was also carried out in this way. So on sample C, which you can see there in the top right-hand corner, the linen backing, excuse me, was stretched taut on the frame, and then the cotton wadding was placed on top of it in roughly a square shape, and then the velvet put on the top and pinned in place, and then we stitched through that through the wadding using the spaced running stitches. And finally, in sample D, again the linen backing is stretched on the frame, the velvet's pinned on to keep it in place, parallel lines of running stitches were worked through the velvet and the linen layers, and the cotton wadding stuffed inside the tubes, again using the wooden spoon handle to help us do that. And at this point, we thought, certainly from a visual point of view, that samples B and D, which were stitched first and then stuffed with the wooden spoon, looked the nicest and produced the best effects. We felt that working on the frame provided more precision and control, and that was going to be a more reliable method to use. However, we did wonder whether the sample C, where we'd piled the wadding on the top and then put the velvet on and stitched through the wadding, might have been more successful if we had more wadding in it. It was been quite difficult to control the amount of wadding using this method. So in order to work out how much wadding we should be putting in, we turned again to information that was provided by Lisa Monas, who's been looking at these accounts of Edward III's armourer. And in those accounts, she told us that the armourer stated that 3 pounds of cotton was allowed for an accaton and 2 pounds for a doublet. So on that basis, not knowing exactly what this garment would have been categorised as, we decided we'd split the difference, and we'd say we would use 2.5 pounds of cotton for the jupon. And we had to calculate how to divide that over the whole garment. So when we went back to the pattern, the Janet Arnold pattern, let me show you that. Actually, maybe I did put it next. Let me see. No. There we go. If we look at the pattern, we figured that the body pieces and the skirt pieces, and then each half sleeve, approximated the same kind of area. And conveniently, that meant that we could just divide our wadding equally into 10. So I'll just whiz through those images again. So the 2.5 pounds divided by 10 equaled 3.75 ounces, which we had these scales in the studio that were post office scales, and they are in grams. So we had to convert that into grams. And so what we could then do was weigh out exactly the right amount of wadding for each piece, and then just endeavour to fit it all into each of our pattern pieces. Oh, I had put the pattern. There you go, there's the pattern again. So what you can see here is Harriet in the studio, and we've stretched the linen backing onto the embroidery frame, and she's measured out the allocated amount of wadding, and she's arranging it within the perimeter of the pattern piece, which has been drawn directly onto the linen. The way that we laid the wadding, in order to have a bit more control, because we'd struggled with our sample, was, I don't know if any of you have made felt or seen felt being made, but the way that that works is that you card your wool into kind of soft combed even pieces, and you lay your carded pieces down as if you're laying roof tiles. So you lay them slightly overlapping in one direction, and then you turn the direction and lay another layer and keep rotating. And by doing that, we felt that we were laying as even an area of wadding as we could, rather than just piling it all in. I should say before I progress that before we really fixed on the method of this method of putting the wadding inside the garment, we sent all of the samples to Lisa Monas, because she was down in Canterbury with the original garment. So she was able to compare our worked samples with the original and give us feedback on what she thought mirrored the original technique the best. And luckily she concurred with us that our sample that we'd worked on the frame, laying the wadding down first like this and then stitching through, was the most successful and best represented what had been done in the original. So that was reassuring and helpful. So what you can see now is the velvet pinned over that big pile of wadding, and creating this very poofy cushion that we then had to stitch through. When we did the samples, we worked out that there was an amount of shrinkage when we did the quilting. It was about 10% shrinkage of the pattern piece across the horizontal. We didn't lose anything on the vertical. So all of our pattern pieces in the velvet were enlarged by 10% across the width to allow for that shrinking in the quilting process. And then we drew out our quilting lines directly onto the velvet so that we could use them as a guide before carrying out the stitching. And so here you can see we've got a half a sleeve with the first 2 lines of quilting carried out. But the quilting was worked in an unbleached linen thread that was waxed. And we found that the best results were achieved if we started in the center and then worked our way out to the edges of the pattern piece. We found that there were 2 challenges to this process. One was that the waxed thread had a tendency to grab little pieces of the cotton wadding and kind of pull it through as we were stitching. But we discovered that that only really happened with the first few stitches. And actually that tendency was significantly decreased if we ironed our thread first, so that the wax was more absorbed into the thread. And also if we just used our thumbnail to kind of push the velvet down as we pulled the linen thread up to stop the cotton wadding coming through. And also once the thread had gone through a few times, it just stopped doing it. So I was a bit worried we'd end up with little white tufts of cotton coming all the way through all of the piece, but that luckily didn't happen. And the second challenge really was just that it's so thick that the velvet had a bit of a tendency to want to kind of travel in the direction that we were sewing it in. And so we just had to be very aware of that and angle our needles so that as we stitched, we kind of pulled the fabric back towards ourselves as we were sewing. But we did, I thought that this whole process of the quilting would really take an incredibly long time, but actually once we had our technique honed, we really sped up. And the lovely thing about this process, and in fact the lovely thing about the whole process of making these garments for this program, was that when you're working by hand as a team, it's a very sociable experience. We were all sat around the frame chatting and joking, and it's a very rewarding process that you're all working on something together, much as the embroiderers in India were doing at the same time. So here's one completed panel from the right side, and you can see every now and again there's a little bit of white wadding that comes through, but we felt we could live with that. And then we've got the same panel on the underside, and of course the disadvantage of working on a frame is that you can't see what the stitching is doing on the other side, so you'd sort of turn it over and hope that it wasn't too bad, and it wasn't. In any case, the whole garment is lined so that you can't see the stitches in the final piece. So once all the quilting was completed, it was cut off of the frame, which was quite an exciting moment. And the raw edges around all of the parts were folded to the inside and caught down with more hand stitching. You'll notice that the neck edge hasn't been caught down, and that's because we've got some evidence from the original that that neck was bound with another piece of fabric. So now that all the quilting was done, we were just waiting for the embroidery to arrive from India, which was quite nerve-wracking, but also exciting. And when the parcel arrived, this is Hannah, who's literally just opened it from India. It was unbelievably exciting. It was a real highlight of the whole process to see how beautifully the embroiderers had worked the pieces, and then to see how it was going to look when we cut them out and put them onto the velvet. This was really exciting and also quite a daunting process, because the embroidery was so beautiful, and what we had to do was cut round all of these pieces that the embroiderers had worked by hand in order to attach them to our velvet. And where I had overestimated how much time it would take to quilt the jupon itself, I really did underestimate how long it would take to cut out all of the pieces and pin them onto the velvet and then sew round. It was really fiddly and really time consuming. And in fact, each panel took about an hour to do. And this process was happening quite late in the day. We didn't actually have a lot of time left. So we really had to burn some midnight oil to actually get all of these motifs onto the jupon in time. But you can see how lovely it looked when we did do it. The contrast of the gold and on the red velvet and on the blue velvet was really stunning. And although we were tired, it was a lovely process, very rewarding. So once all of the embroidery had been put onto the individual panels, what was left to do was just to join them all up. So excuse me. So the method we used to join those panels up was a whip stitch, which is frequently used on early garments before, pre-machine sewing. So you would have your two hemmed edges or two finished edges, you put right sides together and over sew or whip stitch them together. It's quite a fast method, and it creates a neat kind of edge to edge join. So what you can see here is all of the pieces assembled using that whip stitched method. On the original jupon at Canterbury, there's no evidence of lining, and the reason for that is because in the 19th century, it was taken down from being hung over the top of the monument for conservation. And the 19th century approach to conservation was to glue the jupon directly to a backing of leather to stabilize it and enable it to be hung back up above the tomb. So it worked in that the jupon is still with us, but sadly we've lost any evidence of what's going on the inside of the jupon because it's completely obscured by leather. However, we could go back to the documentary evidence, and again, Lisa Monas furnished us with some information, which from her transcripts of Edward III's armourer, the documents for the armourer, he had lined a group of acatons with a red fabric called aylsham in 1330. And this was quite an interesting discovery because we've actually got numerous accounts from the 14th century through the 15th, the 16th, and actually there are still some in relatively recent history of red being used to line garments or to make garments which are worn very close to the skin. So it's not for display because it's not seen by anybody once the garment's on. We actually believe that it's to do with the belief that people had at the time of red being a health-giving colour. So, for example, Henry VIII's physician told him or recommended that he should wear a waistcoat or petticoat of red flannel over his shirt and under his doublet. Queen Elizabeth I was supposed to have been saved from the smallpox by being wrapped in red flannel and laid in front of the fire. And women's undergarments in the 16th century, the petticoats that they wore underneath their outer layers and therefore not seen, according to the documentary evidence, was almost always red. So it makes a lot of sense that a defensive garment and one that would be worn in battle might be lined in red for its health-giving properties. So we got some red linen to line the garment, and then the neck was bound in a white linen because there were remnants of this on the original garment, so we did the same. And then also you can see in this picture actually the eyelets down the front. So when I said earlier that the photograph of the original is it viewed from the back, the front was fastened edge to edge with lacing through eyelet holes. So there are 40 hand-worked eyelets on each side of the jupon, so a total of 80 hand-sewn eyelets that we had to work right at the end of the process. And then we thought we were done, and I went back to the Janet Arnold pattern and notes and discovered, or maybe I'd read it before and conveniently forgotten, but reread a section where she states all of the seams in the jupon are overlaid with a silk cord of twisted blue and red thread. And that was a bit of a moment because we didn't happen to have a cord lying around made from red and blue silk. So we had to make some very quickly. So we bought some red and blue silk, and we found a device on Amazon which was for doing twisted hairstyles. So you could put a hank of hair, or in this case silk thread, in the two different sides, and it twisted it together to make a cord. So we were able actually to make this cord very, very quickly and then hand stitch the cord over the top of all of the seams. And then here, of course, is the completed jupon over the top of armour. We filmed it both on a mannequin over the armour and also then Amber got into some different armour and put the jupon on as well, and with some training from Toby Capwell on how to wield a sword and to fight in the jupon, she did some of those moves for the programme. The silver strips that you can see on the chest and on the arms are the labels of cadency, which are there to mark out the son of the king. So on the battlefield, the king's jupon would have looked exactly the same, but without the silver strips. And the son of the king, the first son, has the 3 bars coming down from a horizontal bar. That embroidery was also carried out by the team in India. So the reconstructed jupon weighs 6.5 pounds. So there's the 2.5 pounds of cotton plus all the other materials. And it represents 1,056 hours of work, or 132 days. But of course, carried out by a team of 10 people, including the 7 embroiderers. So that's it. Thank you for listening. And I'm very happy to take some questions. I'll stop screen sharing so that we can chat.
I've got a question. So the use of the use of cotton in this garment, was he able to get a hold of cotton because of his status and his wealth, or would cotton have been a common padding at this time?
It was a common padding. It was quite surprising that even though it's an imported textile, it's coming from North Africa via Spain. It was coming in quite large quantities and was pretty widely used as a stuffing material.
Was that the case throughout most of the Middle Ages, or did that start to become a trend at any point?
It's certainly common by the 14th century. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the first record is of cotton being used in England, but because my specialist period is actually the 16th century, and it's very widely used then. And I know of lots of 14th century references, but I would have to check as to exactly how early that goes back. Maybe someone here knows.
Gotcha. Thank you.
There was a question in the chat from Emma, and she was wondering if she didn't know if she'd missed it or not, but what kind of velvet did you use for the project?
Well, it would have been a pure silk velvet, of course. That's really quite difficult to get hold of now. I think there are 1 or 2 Italian suppliers that do a pure silk velvet, and it's prohibitively expensive. Again, BBC budget didn't stretch to that. I have used a silk cotton mix in the past, but again, that is also very expensive. So this velvet is actually just cotton, but it's a very high quality cotton with a short, very soft pile. It feels quite convincing. And I would say it's much better than if you go into a shop nowadays and you ask for a silk velvet, what you'll be shown usually is a silk viscose or silk rayon mix, which doesn't behave at all like a period velvet. It's a very kind of fluid, floppy, drapey fabric, which will drive you nuts. So I don't recommend using that. A good quality cotton is much better, I would say.
Is that the one you made for the BBC behind you, or did you make a second one for yourself?
Oh, that's the actual one. So he looks slightly odd because we put this jupon on the mannequin earlier today, and he didn't have any other clothing on, and it looked a bit raunchy, to be quite honest. So we put a shirt on him to hide his modesty, but the shirt isn't the right period. But I thought it's still nice to have it there. I kept the jupon because basically, even with the compromises we made with the velvet, for example, and the tambour hooks used by the embroiderers, it was still outside of the budget really that the BBC could afford. So we negotiated that with that, and with a couple of the other garments we made for the programme, I would get to keep them afterwards so that I could do more with them, and that's how we kind of settled that balance. So I've had the jupon ever since, and we'll often give talks and workshops, and so people can see it and handle it.
I had to go get mine I saw yours up here. So this is I when I had this made for me, it's not nearly as fancy as the Black Prince one, but I based it off of the patterns that you showed in your talk
Okay.
when it was done for me. So it's constructed the same way, just not nearly as thick or fancy. Someone asked, do you have any idea of what where'd it go? What corners were cut when somebody who was less wealthy would have commissioned something like this?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, an obvious difference would be no gold. And that wasn't just about what you could afford. That was the 14th century is also the time that the sumptuary legislation comes in, and things like gold thread and certain colors of silk, so specifically blue silk, that would include velvet, were not permitted to people outside of the royal family, or certainly below the level of the elite nobility. So the materials and techniques used in this jupon really do mark the wearer out as a royal person. As I say, even if you could afford it, you wouldn't be allowed it.
I think we have time for one last question. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask?
I see there was a question about the spinning technology.
Spinning technology.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, I think I don't know how early cotton was actually spun here in England, but what happened was we started getting imported thread. By the 17th century, we had 100% woven cotton materials were available, and before that, what we had were the cotton was spun into a thread, but it was still very weak. So what you would have is a union fabric. So you would have a fabric where the warp on the loom, which had to be strong, would be made from either linen or worsted wool. And then the cotton was only used for the weft to go across where the strength wasn't required. So that's where you get fabrics like fustian, which had cotton in them, but they weren't 100% cotton.
Well, Ninya and Mikhaila, thank you so much for joining us today and presenting this absolutely gorgeous project that you worked on. It was fascinating to see how it all came together and see a little bit of the behind the scenes work that we didn't get to see in the television show. So folks, what we're going to do now is we're going to set up for the second session. What I think I'm probably going to have to do is kick everybody off and then have you rejoin the room, just put you all back in the waiting room basically, and then we'll go from there. So thank you all so much, and thank you again. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks very much.
Bye.